secondary education critical perspectives. I think it's very interesting. We have four speakers here today. Dr. Andy Hansen has just informed me that he's a retired elementary teacher. Caitlin Hewitt-Weiss, and she will be presenting a paper that you co-wrote, and the other person is not here. So there is Duncan, who I'm sure I know you from somewhere.
Okay.
It'll come to me. As Italians, we're prone to revenge because we can't forget anything.
Well, that's a good thing.
So you don't know.
I know. I can't say that because you will remember, and then I'll feel like
I can't forget. I told you, it's a Southern Italian thing. That's why we're prone to revenge. We just can't forget. It's not much as hard as we try. And it's Ruth. Pronounce your last name, Ruth?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So, good afternoon. And I just want to say this, for me, has been an extremely exciting conference. When you sit at home over your laptop, sometimes you get a feeling that there's just you printing these thoughts, and then I walk in here and there's a room full of people. So this is very, very exciting. Not my computer, so I'm going to have to figure it out as I go. All right, so neoliberalism in Ontario classrooms, 1975 to 1998. Works. Okay, my paper briefly examines the activities of the province's two elementary teachers' unions, the Federation of Women Teachers Associations of Ontario, FWTAO, and the Ontario Public School Teachers Federation, OPSTF, which formerly was known as the Ontario Public School Men Teachers Federation, between 1975 and 1998 to trace the effects of neoliberalism on education. I apply Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis's understanding of the relationship between education reform and capitalist structures, which they call the correspondence principle, the replication in the school system of changing social hierarchies in the workplace. Ryerson's Alan Sears refers to this as the construction of the post-liberal education system, that is, the aligning of schools to the neoliberal vision of the lean state. It is important to note that publicly funded education was indispensable to the neoliberal project. Neoliberals simply wanted to pay less for it. The push for education reform in Ontario in the final quarter of the 20th century was ideologically driven, and the apparatuses were applied from the top down. Reforms were not intended to broaden the scope of education or to improve the quality of schooling, quite the opposite. Structures intrinsic to neoliberalism that developed as corresponding forms in the education system in Ontario included a tax on unions and reduction of workers' wages, cutting funding for social programs, aggressive top-down management, external standards of performance and detailed data gathering, also known as metrics, and the proletarianization of skilled labor. Other traits such as contracting out and moving jobs offshore did not directly affect teaching. So to begin, in 1975 and again in 1982, Prime Minister Trudeau introduced wage and price controls. They restricted wages and constrained collective bargaining with only a token reference to regulating prices. The controls were unmistakably an attack on unions and a means of reducing workers' earning power. It was this response by the state to a specific financial crisis that opened the door to the rise of the new right in Canada and established a model for future state practices. In 1982 in Ontario, Conservative Premier Bill Davis followed Trudeau's lead by introducing the Ontario Inflation Restraint Act, Bill 179. That act fixed a limit on salary increases for public service workers, including teachers, and extended all conditions of their collective agreements for 1 year, shutting down contract negotiations that were already in progress. History has repeated itself. It also contained components that pitted one category of teacher against another in an effort to disrupt the unions. Trudeau's strategy turned the legislative conditions at the core of the RAND formula against workers to undermine collective bargaining. He opened the space for the state to defy or reverse collective agreement language unilaterally and without fear of reprisal. Wage and price controls ended in 1985. In the same year, Prime Minister Mulroney announced cuts to funding for social programs by reducing transfer payments to the provinces to the tune of $2 billion even though the Canadian economy was strong. In Ontario, the Peterson Liberal government was on the receiving end of those cuts. Provincial funding for education would slip from a previous high of 60% to 40% before the education budget was entirely taken over by the province under Mike Harris. The Peterson Liberals began the modern trend towards aggressive top-down management. They funded 2 studies of accountability frameworks in 1986. They were the performance appraisal for professional service employees, non-technical report, and the future performance appraisal for certificated education staff in the school boards of Ontario. They proposed measurable outcomes, limiting teachers' discretion, and developing tighter links between schools and business interests. We've heard a lot of that today. Under pressure from the teachers' unions and the NDP, Peterson shelved the reports. In 1995, Mike Harris's Conservatives dusted them off and instituted them. By 1993, austerity programs had become the universally accepted solution to failures in the capitalist economic system. The recession that had begun almost as soon as the NDP had been elected had lasted 3 years. In June of 1993, Premier Bob Rae tabled the Social Contract Act, forcing public service workers, including teachers, to take pay cuts of 4.6% in the form of layoff days for each of the next 3 years. By presenting wage cuts as the only credible solution, the NDP Premier justified further attacks on workers and reinforced the ideological assumptions that supported an austerity agenda. Mike Harris was elected in 1995. More than any other Premier of Ontario, he embraced neoliberalism. Conservative legislation that directly affected teachers included Bill 7, an act to restore balance and stability to labor relations and to promote economic prosperity, which undermined the ability of unions to organize workers, making it more difficult for the teachers' unions to sign up non-teaching education workers, something the OPSTF and the secondary teachers have been doing for some time. The Pay Equity Act was repealed by Bill 8, an act to repeal job quotas and to restore merit-based employment practices in Ontario. The teachers' unions rushed to include pay equity in the collective agreements and were successful in doing so. Women workers in sectors that had not already achieved pay equity were denied access to further improvements and would continue to carry the burden of lower wages even as the number of women in the workplace increased. But it would be Bill 160, the Education Quality Improvement Act, that directly attacked teachers' unions and would become the provocation for the largest teacher strike in North America. Bill 160 removed the authority of school boards to tax threatened teachers' wages. The teachers' unions were placed under the Ontario Labour Relations Act, restructuring their collective bargaining regime. The Minister of Education was given the power to override collective agreements and to prevent strikes, effectively giving the employer control of the bargaining process. The school year was extended, staffing and class size language in collective agreements was swept aside, and teachers' preparation time was reduced. Bill 160 also removed the obligation of school boards to deduct union dues under the RAND formula. Harris's cuts to social programs were far more serious than Brian Mulroney's had been. The Conservatives' common sense revolution was economic in its intent, and it succeeded. The Harris government reduced spending on education alone by $2 billion a year. Mike Harris firmly entrenched an aggressive top-down disciplining body in the Ontario education system by creating the College of Teachers and ensuring that it was under state control. The idea, first been floated by Bill Davis's Minister of Education, Betty Stevenson, suggested again by Monique Bejan and Gerald Kaplan, who has co-chaired the NDP's Royal Commission on Learning. The college was a discipline mechanism that threatened all teachers with public shaming and the possibility of losing their certification for arcane and arbitrary reasons. The Harris platform for education is called New Directions 2, a blueprint for learning in Ontario. It called for accountability frameworks, wide-ranging data gathering, and narrowing the focus of education to literacy and numeracy. One of its most important strategies for advancing neoliberal discipline in the schools was establishing external standards of performance through standardized tests. Standardized tests shifted the purpose of evaluation from examining a student's competence within a specific subject matter to applying external norms as a measurement of teachers' productivity. The Education Quality and Accountability Office, EQAO, was charged with designing and managing a test and compiling the results for each school and each school board across the province. The Fraser Institute absolutely loves it. It was the apparatus through which the state was able to quantify education using standardized tests that were centrally developed, administered, and scored. The EQAO regime forced the rhetoric of best practices and focused learning on the classroom, deprofessionalizing teaching by narrowing the reach of education and locking teachers into prescribed strategies that were applied across schools and boards of education. Despite the face of education being dramatically reconfigured over 2 decades, the neoliberal advance was not even. During this period, women teachers made significant advances uncoupling gender from work. Women teachers achieved formal affirmative action programs under the Davis Conservatives. Pay equity was finally realized and defined as work of equal value under the Peterson Liberals. At the end of 1990, Peterson expanded junior kindergarten programs and expanded senior kindergarten programs and introduced junior kindergarten, an expansion of social policy that was not in character with neoliberal pressure for tax cuts. With the 1990 election of the NDP, teachers gained control of their pensions. That achievement would prove critical to protecting the teachers' pensions in a time when workers in the private sector were losing theirs. Education occupied a contradictory position in the construction of the neoliberal state. As the principal institution in the disciplining of workers to the demands of the capitalist workplace, it was essential to reducing expectations of the privileges of citizenship and to shrinking the obligations of the state to its citizens. Education reforms were focused on reproducing worker citizens who were molded to the emerging hegemony of accept a more precarious, flexible workplace. An unfettered capitalism required reorientation of the education system to accept the supremacy of the marketplace. Yet education was and remains a social service provided by unionized workers who seek collective benefit through their labor organizations to defend against the predations of capitalism. So, while the advance of neoliberalism in Ontario was uneven, it was also resisted by organized labor. In 1982, the elementary teachers took a step away from their professionalist identity that had distanced them historically from labor, and with the other 3 teachers' unions joined the public sector coalition to pursue collective action against Bill Davis's wage controls. Public sector workers rallied in cities across the province, and in Ontario, they marched together as a body to Queen's Park. Although it would be a short-lived alliance, for the first time teachers were united with other unions in a campaign. Then in 1995, the teachers' unions became involved in the Ontario Federation of Labour's Days of Action campaign against the Harris government. It was a province-wide campaign that involved teachers in every local, far wider and deeper than the public sector coalition had been. In February 1996, the teachers' unions took a leadership role in organizing the 2-day Hamilton Days of Action, one of the largest political protests in the province's history. Then in October 1997, all of Ontario's teachers walked out of their classrooms for 2 weeks in an effort to defeat Bill 160. Mel Watkins makes the point that neoliberalism is dependent on the argument that society is made up of individuals who are propelled by economic forces over which they have little control. Such a passive and preordained view of political economy isolates individuals and discourages the formation of resistance. When the teachers walked out, they undermined the ideological rhetoric of neoliberalism and challenged the helplessness claim. There was, in fact, an alternative. Despite teachers' efforts, their strike was not a success. With their majority in the legislature, the Conservatives passed Bill 160. At the high point of their public support, the leaders of the AEFO, Francophone teachers, the FWTAO, and the OPSTF announced that they would be returning to their classrooms. Despite the collapse of resistance, the teachers did win 3 important victories. Working conditions remained in teachers' collective agreements. Teachers retained their right to collective bargaining, including the right to strike, and the REN formula continued to be applied. As Bowles and Gintis proposed, there is a correspondence effect in the relationship between education reform and capitalist structures, although it is uneven. I argue that in the Ontario case, between 1975 and 1998, the advance of neoliberalism in education was mitigated by the efforts of the teachers' unions.